Well, excellent. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining today's webinar from Audubon Mid-Atlantic. We're calling it Advocating for Renewable Energy in the Mid-Atlantic region. Today, we're joined by Tess Wilson of Audubon Mid-Atlantic, Chris Haney, and John Belak of the National Audubon Society. And we're looking forward to a good discussion today on Audubon's perspectives on renewable energy development in the region and what you can do to help with that. Tess will be monitoring the chat, and we're going to save time for questions at the end. So please, if you have questions, please keep them in mind and make sure to put them in the question and answer box and or in the chat, and we will get to as many as we can before the hour is up. So with that, I'm going to get started. My name is, are they advancing? No, not advancing.
No, try again.
Okay. How about now?
Not
Nothing.
yet.
Okay. Okay. Well,
Yep.
there we go.
It worked.
Yeah, great. So here's our rough agenda for the hour. My name's Jim Brown. I'm the policy director at Audubon Mid-Atlantic. And today we'll be talking about solar development and wind development after a brief overview of who Audubon Mid-Atlantic is. John will talk about solar development and Audubon's role in the development of solar energy. And Chris will talk about wind development, both offshore and onshore wind, and again, Audubon's role in that process. After that, there's a few action items for the Mid-Atlantic region in Maryland and Pennsylvania that I wanted you to be aware of. And then we'll get to questions that either our panelists inspire you or that you have about the process. So with that, a little bit about our policy priorities in the region. We respond to the threats that birds face. Audubon Mid-Atlantic's main focus areas are habitat conservation and through coastal and forest resiliency, engaging members and expanding our constituency throughout the region, identifying sustained public funding to support conservation efforts and natural climate solutions, protecting watersheds in the region with a big focus on the Delaware River watershed and the Chesapeake Bay area in Maryland and Pennsylvania, and ensuring that everyone in the region has access to outdoor spaces that make our region special. And then what we'll be talking about today is advancing the development of renewable energy. So how do we do this? We work with diverse coalitions. We educate lawmakers. We work with lawmakers. We are often invited to testify at bill hearings in Annapolis and in Harrisburg. We work to write op-eds on issues that matter to Audubon and our members. And we collaborate with our chapter network and our member network throughout the region. And that can take on working with chapters to submit letters to the editor, working on learning tours, writing letters of support for different initiatives, different projects. So really engaging our members and connecting them with decision makers and influential people that in the policy sphere throughout the region. And then importantly, we form partnerships with the environmental community and community groups throughout our region. So now my slides are advancing. Great. So we cannot do this without you. Birds need you. They need you to be their advocate. They need you to speak on their behalf in Annapolis and in Harrisburg and in Washington, D.C. And they need you to enlist your community to support their help too. They need you to vote, and they need you to have fun doing all of the above. So, and one of the ways that you're doing that is by joining us today. So thank you very much. And we look forward to working with you on these important issues for the health of birds and communities in the Mid-Atlantic. So, unfortunately, birds do face a lot of threats. Since 1970, many bird populations have seen enormous losses due to habitat loss and climate change. We know that 3 billion North American birds have been lost since 1970. And our vision is to really change that trajectory, to bend the bird curve back. And we're doing that through our flight plan, which is our National Audubon Society strategic plan over the next 5 years. So, and that has five main pillars, which are habitat conservation, two related to climate action, policy, and community building. The two that are related to climate action are developing natural climate solutions, so are using the ecosystems as a tool to mitigate against climate change and slow down climate change. And the one that we're talking about today is the swift and responsible deployment of renewable energy. So that goal specifically calls for 100 gigawatts of renewable energy generation to be and transmission to be responsibly sited throughout the United States over the next 5 years. So this is the swift and responsible deployment of renewable energy resources to accelerate decarbonization, curbing the long-term impacts of climate change, minimizing the short-term impacts on birds through well-sited and operated solar and wind farms, which we'll be talking about today. So really, the science tells us that birds are under threat, and I'm going to read some notes because through this slide, so bear with me. But yeah, the Audubon science report entitled "Survival by Degrees" shows that 389 species are on the brink. It found that 2/3 of North American birds are at an increasing risk of extinction from global temperature rise. The report also found that if we act now, we can protect the majority of our vulnerable birds. Over 90 species in Pennsylvania and Maryland are vulnerable to climate change. This includes common species like flickers and goldfinches, and even the ruffed grouse will lose 50% of its range if we do nothing. The impact is even greater on migratory warblers throughout the region. But birds also provide ecosystem services, such as forest health and pollination. So what impacts birds impacts all of us. Audubon uses science and research to be a trusted voice for bird-friendly renewable energy siting, management, and transmission that helps accelerate the right policies to tackle climate change and the threat that it poses. As we transition to clean energy, we will increase the demand for renewable energy to power our homes, businesses, cars, and industry. Yet we face emerging conflicts over competing land uses and local opposition. At the same time, this rate of renewable energy development is outpacing the speed of the development of our transmission grids. To address this, we will need to rapidly accelerate renewable energy siting and the development of transmission infrastructure in a way that is not harmful to birds and bird habitat. We know that transitioning to clean energy is crucial, not only for birds, for the hundreds of bird species that face habitat loss and extinction, but also for the frontline communities that are impacted as well. As we pursue wind, solar, and transmission development, we advocate for policies that ensure projects avoid fragmentation and destruction of rare, unique, and sensitive conservation habitats like marshes and wetlands, paying special attention to migratory pathways, important bird areas, and wildlife corridors. We also prioritize projects that adhere to the mitigation hierarchy, which you'll hear more about soon. This hierarchy advocates for avoidance, minimization, and restoration or replacement of impacts to species or habitat through mitigation. Good siting, minimizing damage through available best practices, and repairing any impacts that cannot otherwise be avoided protects against the loss of these vulnerable natural resources and bird habitat. So before I hand it over to our panelists today, I just wanted to provide a snapshot of where Maryland and Pennsylvania are with solar and wind. Currently, Maryland gets about 6% of its energy from solar. Pennsylvania gets 0.6% of its energy produced from solar. And wind, Maryland is 1.6%, and Pennsylvania is also close to 1.6%. And you can see the associated megawatts there. So that's a picture of where we are, and we know that it's not where we need to be to meet our climate goals. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to John and Chris. Before I do that, I'm going to read a brief bio for both of them, and then they'll get going. So John is the Senior Manager of Data and Science at National Audubon Society's Clean Energy Initiative. Prior to Audubon, John worked for 15 years at various national conservation NGOs on clean energy siting, as well as in consulting, doing quantitative data analysis, federal agency outreach and coordination, avian protection plans, wildlife biology, and design of renewable energy and natural resource impact assessments. John has a bachelor's degree in cultural anthropology from Cal Poly Humboldt and a master's degree in wildlife biology from Colorado State. He also has professional certification in recording studio engineering from UCLA, which he received in his late teens in the era of magnetic tape. Chris Haney is a conservation biologist, wildlife researcher, and author of more than 250 peer-reviewed journal articles, technical reports, and science summaries. He has delivered 150 research and public speaking engagements to national and international audiences. He has received numerous awards for his outstanding science and public service, for his expertise for documenting the impacts on wildlife and advising government responses to the Exxon Valdez oil spill in Alaska and the Deepwater Horizon disaster in the Gulf of Mexico. His most recent book is titled Woody's Last Laugh: How the Extinct Ivory Woodpecker Fools Us into Making 53 Thinking Errors. Currently, he serves as a science advisor to the National Audubon Society for Offshore Wind Energy and Wildlife. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to John.
Okay, thank you, Jim. And hi, everybody. My name is John Belak. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the Senior Manager of Science and Data Analysis for National Audubon Society's Clean Energy Initiative. I'm so glad you joined us today to learn about clean energy and birds. Before we start, I want to make clear the type of solar energy we're talking about. Some of you may have heard about solar power towers, which use ground-based concentric mirror arrays to heat a boiler at the center. I want to stress that these facilities are not feasible in your part of the country. Photovoltaic, or PV solar, which are the same panels you see on rooftops, but at the utility scale, is what we're concerned with today. As you can see in the picture, these facilities cover a lot of real estate, so we want to put them in the right places using a considered and well-informed approach that will help us understand the risks and the trade-offs associated with each project. For example, projects that clear forests, like the one in the image shown seems to have done, may not be a good trade-off. Jim has already given you some detail about how climate action is baked into our new flight plan, with a goal of 100 gigawatts of new renewable energy and transmission cited by 2028. That's a huge amount of energy, and we need the entire network's help. If we all work together as a network, we can do the outreach with industry, agencies, communities, and partner organizations to achieve 100% clean energy. Here are a few charts to put the solar build-out in context versus other energy sources. This chart was taken from the most recent National Climate Assessment, and it shows that in the future, solar will be king. Although it only makes up 5% of our nation's electricity mix now, it will increase 6.6 times by 2050. Wind, on the other hand, will only increase 2.2 times, and much of that stands to come from offshore wind, as Chris is about to tell you. Other renewables are projected to stay mostly flat, nuclear will decrease slightly, and of course, fossil fuels will take a dive. There will be a need for a substitute for that lost energy. Projecting future technology growth is always tenuous, of course, and some new technological advance could change the game, but given our current understanding, solar energy is expected to reign supreme. This next chart here shows that despite our ever more efficient devices, our overall electricity use will continue to increase, and that's largely driven by industry and transportation, and with considerable uncertainty in their trajectory over time. As individuals, we have little influence on these, but using our collective influence as Audubon, we can help drive the policy change that will flatten the consumption curve, and through that, bend the bird curve up. As you can see in this map of the nation's solar resource, your area has lower potential than other areas. That's increasingly less important, though. Population centers, renewable energy policies, transmission access, and so many other factors have become more important as solar has been built out across the US. So look at this map for a few more seconds, noting the areas with darkest shades of orange and red that show the highest solar resource. And then I'll change the slide to show installed solar as of 2022. Okay, so 3, 2, 1, boom. As you can see, there's little direct relationship. If the nation had an electric grid that was able to transfer power efficiently from the most productive solar areas in the nation to the least, the pattern would be different. But fundamentally, it's not only about the location of the resource, but also the users and the infrastructure. So the clustering of dots, as you can see, is already quite heavy in your area, and there's more to come. Okay, so I've given you some background on the coming domination of solar energy, the reality that it's coming soon to a place near you, and the proposition that we work together on this. Before that, Jim went over why it's absolutely essential for the future of birds to replace dirty energy sources with clean energy. And like any technology we've ever introduced, we expect that there's going to be negative impacts and unforeseen problems. So what is our approach for tackling this huge open-ended issue? Well, we'd like to break the problem into pieces and use the 3 Ps. The first P is policy. Audubon is fully engaged at the federal and state level to help create the policy space for clean energy to grow and thrive. The second P, or maybe it's a PP, is planning processes at the regional landscape level to identify least conflict areas and focus on cumulative impacts. The final P is projects. Audubon's Clean Energy Initiative doesn't have the capacity to engage in all but the largest and most visible projects, which is why we're trying to enlist you to be our eyes and ears, our boots on the ground, and our voices in the public meeting and in comment letters, saying good things about clean energy, or at least making constructive suggestions for changes. This is the hardest part, but if we engage whatever it makes the most sense, we can make incremental progress and benefit our local bird community. So let's start with the first P. In terms of policies, Audubon is strongly supportive of prioritizing development in the built environment whenever possible, such as in parking lots or on rooftops. Similarly, brownfields, where previous development has already come and gone, should be prioritized whenever development is feasible. Ordinances that effectively shut out clean energy projects from states or counties and are often funded disingenuously by entrenched interests are a trap to stall and prevent clean energy progress. It's a top Audubon priority to expose the damaging effects of these policies, the counterfactual of continued climate change and how it will decimate birds gives us a perspective that we need to see these tactics, which feed off selfishness and mistrust, for what they are, an impediment to the positive change we need to make for birds. The second P is planning processes. These are typically state-sponsored, like the one I'm about to talk about, but I'm also working very hard right now on a federal planning process for solar that stands to affect many millions of acres across the Western US. That process is called the U.S. Bureau of Land Management Solar Programmatic Environmental Impact Statement, and we'll be submitting comments on that in mid-April. Unfortunately, I don't have anything for your area to talk about today, but hopefully we can change that. Instead, I'm going to talk about the effort we did in Washington State, which was funded by the state and managed by the Washington State Energy Program with technical assistance provided by the nonprofit Conservation Biology Institute. In this process, conservation, ranching, farming, and solar developer stakeholder groups met jointly and then separately to each work out a map of their high priority areas. The final maps for each group were then combined to produce a map of solar suitability for the entire eastern part of the state, where utility scale solar will be built out. The analysis used a method that's called fuzzy logic that, despite the name, works to encode a group's detailed knowledge and preferences into a map and then combine those maps in a way that's data-driven and impartial. It facilitates the activities shown on the slide: getting assumptions and pressure points in the open, identifying shared priorities through data, exploring cumulative effects at the right scale, and setting, justifying, and implementing timelines for planning goals. Audubon Washington worked very hard to get the state process funded and underway. They contributed data layers that they created through the chapters, and I curated ones from many other sources. And together we built an internal screening tool to evaluate projects. So when the state process started, we were well poised to do a full court press of engagement, and we did make it count. If you look at the priority areas, that came out of this process, they excluded almost all of the high value areas that we identified, while still allowing ample area for solar build out. We hope to do the same for the Bureau of Land Management's solar programmatic EIS. The project level is where we really get into the weeds. Not really, though. What we really advocate strongly for is native plants, where appropriate, and ground treatments that provide some value to pollinators and other wildlife where not appropriate. Bird-friendly solar that incorporates specific mowing regimes to minimize impacts and maximize habitat value are key, as is wildlife-friendly fencing that maintains habitat permeability for important species. Conservation easements off-site or adjacent to projects that compensate for project impacts are something we consistently advocate for. Finally, one of the well-known impacts associated with solar sites is the power lines that they require to tie into the grid, often referred to as gen ties. Within projects, lines are typically buried, but between the project and the high voltage transmission line it ties into are potential areas of concern. It's becoming more feasible to bury lines of increasingly higher voltages, which minimizes risks not only to birds from wildfire outages, not only to birds, but also, from wildfire outages and so on. So as technology improves and undergrounding becomes more feasible, we are pushing for that. But in the meantime, there are proven approaches to reduce avian collision mortality with higher voltage transmission and collision and electrocution mortality with lower voltage distribution lines to reduce these sources of bird mortality well below the level of population level of risk for any species. When it comes to birds and solar, though, we don't know a lot, and we don't know what we don't know. So that's where the big R comes in to complement the three Ps. The big R is research. Research on avian interactions with solar facilities is essential to justify our support of clean energy. If we can show the effects of build-out will be minimal, we will be guaranteed to get net conservation benefit for birds. One of our most important efforts in this area has been the Avian Solar Working Group. Audubon is a founding member and primary contributor to this group, which includes all the NGO and industry organizations you see here. The goal of the group is to advance coordinated scientific research that will help us understand how birds interact with solar facilities so we can avoid, minimize, and mitigate impacts using the best science. A few examples of the research supported by the working group include a library of feathers collected from solar facilities that can be used to map bird populations and migration, as well as their individual genetics, a potential treasure trove to understand avian solar interactions. Also, monitoring birds through camera systems coupled with artificial intelligence is helping to tease out the nuances of bird behavior and understand if solar sites could be managed in a positive way as bird habitat, as well as how they could become ecological sinks that are counterproductive for birds. A third area is research on the lake effect hypothesis, that birds can mistake the reflected light from solar rays for water and attempt to land or divert their movements towards sites, leading to direct mortality or lack of fitness. These are all areas of uncertainty for birds and solar, and without the working group, it's unlikely that they would be funded in as far along as they are now. More work is needed on all these projects, but they're already coming up with some interesting results. Audubon has other research priorities beyond the Avian Solar Working Group. Among these is the need to do the best type of studies. This type is the before-after control impact, or BACI design, which tests the effect of management action by measuring the key traits of the site before the action is performed, as well as after, and not only in the site where the action was done, but also in a similar site where no action was done. This is the most conclusive and thorough type of study, and we would like to see it become the norm for solar research. Audubon is also a founding member and lead NGO participant in the Renewable Energy Wildlife Institute, or REWI, an association of NGO and industry participants that work to accelerate responsible development of renewable energy through science and collaboration. Through REWI, we are working to advance the ecosystem concept for utility scale solar. In this Solar is seen as a novel type of ecosystem that can be managed in such a way as to optimize its value for wildlife and potentially other uses, rather than as a type of converted habitat similar to a parking lot. If this is to be successful, the trade-offs will have to be accurately and meaningfully quantified. There are, of course, limits to the value that a solar site can offer, but what are the landscape and abiotic factors that affect this and result in greater or lesser impacts? This is also a fruitful area for research. And then finally, related to this is what active management strategies can be pursued. All these issues have been explored, much less for solar than they have for wind, and there's much research to be done. So in conclusion, by working the 3 Ps and pursuing the big R to gain certainty about avian solar interactions, we can identify the best places for solar energy that avoid or minimize impacts to birds to the greatest extent possible, compensate effectively for impacts that do occur, and provide the net conservation benefit when combined with the climate change mitigation that clean energy provides. It's a work in progress, and we want you to participate. By showing up in the right way, understanding the need for change, and providing constructive ways for clean energy to thrive alongside birds, we can help bend the bird curve and improve our own lives at the same time. I'd like to hand it off now to our offshore wind expert, Dr. Chris Haney, who's going to tell us about the challenges and opportunities associated with offshore wind. Take it away, Chris.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I've had the fortune of speaking or meeting some of you a few weeks ago at another event up in Annapolis. And I'm actually going to give a bit of a different presentation here. I'm going to talk about offshore wind, but essentially everything that I will show you has similar or even identical effects on birds, at least generically. So if you're thinking, well, what does this have to do with my backyard? What does it have to do with Pennsylvania? The impacts to wildlife from wind energy are generally quite similar from place to place. And there are some peculiarities or some regional differences, which I'll highlight. But I want to sort of give an overview in the following way. First, we'll talk about where we can best get renewable wind energy. There are some places where it's feasible and some places that are just not feasible. Second, we'll look at some of the categories of major impacts to birds and other wildlife. Then we'll look at the mitigation hierarchy to see what we can do about it. How can we limit the damages, the harms, or the adverse impacts to birds and wildlife? And then finally, we'll talk about the importance of monitoring. Monitoring tells us where we need to change and adjust course. Right here, I've depicted a wind capacity or wind generation potential map of offshore waters in the United States. Here, orange represents areas of greater offshore wind potential, and the lighter the shading, the more towards light yellow, the less potential there is. Areas that are in black are either off limits, very often for purposes of national defense, or because the wind energy potential is just too low. If you zoom in, you might look at the mid-Atlantic area where Maryland beaches are and see that it's an area of fairly good wind generation potential for offshore waters. Hence, there is a project that's in the active stages for the state of Maryland. You can go to the next slide. What I've depicted here is a project known as US Wind. US Wind is actually a fairly typical offshore wind project. It's not particularly large, not particularly small, and it has characteristics that we tend to find from one project to the next, at least off the Atlantic side of the United States. Pacific Ocean wind energy areas are different. US Wind consists of 187 wind turbines. Those are the little blue squares that you can see in this picture. The yellow squares are substations where the power is gathered from a subset of turbines, and then that runs into a cable system that delivers the power to shore. Most offshore wind projects just have a single cable system delivering the power to shore. Occasionally, they may have two, but it's rarely ever more than that. The U.S. wind project off Maryland can generate 750 megawatts of power. So that's about 3 or 4 times what is currently gathered from wind energy area in the state. So it's a significant project. That's enough power to deliver electricity to about 500,000 homes. Go ahead, next slide. There are 2 main risks from offshore wind farms, and in fact, wind turbines generally, to birds. And we could sum them up as collision and habitat loss. Those are basically, everything kind of fits into one or more subset of that. There are a few things that were possible impacts or possible effects, but we haven't detected those yet. And I can speak more about those if you're interested in the Q&A session. One of the biggest risks to birds, of course, is collision. A collision that would cause either sublethal injury, injury that would incapacitate a bird, or collisions that lead to death. Interestingly, so far, the news is good. And I'm almost reluctant to say this because it's so good. We've yet to really document much harm to bird from collisions offshore. Now, there are several reasons for that. It's very hard to tell. But when we've been able to put monitoring systems right next to turbines and follow what happens there for a year or two, in one case, we did this off the coast of Virginia, and not a single bird or bat was found to have collided with that turbine. Doesn't mean it never happens, but so far, it looks like birds are mostly avoiding the spinning blades. Another, next slide, please. This is what basically collision looks like. The spinning blade is called the rotor swept zone. When that blade spins fast enough, it creates something called motion shear, meaning that, that little blurry thing that we see from a fan. That is an obstacle, or it's actually an impediment to birds because they cannot detect something that's spinning too fast or fast enough. It just shows up as clear, and then that presents a hazard. So when we look at a particular wind farm and then we break it down to each turbine, there are some danger zones, those are indicated here in red, and some relatively safe zones indicated here in green. One safe zone is the air gap below the lowest part of the turbine blade and the ocean surface. And then, of course, another safe area is the heights above the top of the spinning rotor swept zone. Anytime that a bird comes into this red area, it is at risk of a collision, even if theoretically it could fly through it and get it without getting hit. Next slide, please. We could actually look at the flight heights of birds if we have enough samples and if we have enough research and data to see if they're at risk. This is a risk profile for the brown pelican. And what it shows is that most flying brown pelicans, in this case, we had a sample size of just a little bit less than 500 birds. Most of them are flying at heights below the rotor swept zone. That's good news. But a bit more than 12% are flying high enough to be in that danger zone. This kind of information is essential to have, not just for brown pelicans from one place, but for all birds in all places that offshore wind gets placed. So this is a depiction of a risk profile for one seabird. Next slide, please. Another big concern that we have is habitat loss or habitat displacement. I'm going to have to step back and explain this slide a little bit because unusually the authors used reverse color coding that we typically use for heat maps. This is a depiction of what happens before a wind farm gets put in ocean waters and after in the German North Sea. And the bird studied here are loons. They call them divers there. I believe this was mostly the red-throated loon. In any event, if you look at the two panels before, those are two different wind farms, the Bard one and then the north of Borkum. Those are the black outlined areas are the wind farm, and dark blue areas have more birds. Yellow areas have fewer birds. And if you look at what happened before and after, you can see that these loons were displaced from, they basically left the area where once it was blue, now it's yellow, meaning they're gone. And they didn't just leave the area immediately in or next to those wind farms. They left and took a wide berth as far as 10 or 15 kilometers away from the wind farm. So for this species, it looks like that is a loss of habitat. That is to say, those are waters that it can no longer use during the winter period of its life history. Next slide, please. So if we have negative or adverse impacts to birds, how do we correct for it? What do we do in order to try to make things right? I won't say try, let's just say make things right. We use the mitigation hierarchy, which always consists of 3 steps: avoid, minimize, and compensate. And I'm going to walk us through each one of those as how it is applied to marine birds to show you how we can avoid any impacts or use avoidance to reduce them. If we can't get everything protected through avoidance, we'll go next to minimization. And if those first two don't work, we'll end up trying to compensate it. Now, this is always used, and it's always in this order. None of these are more important than avoidance, and that's the one I'll explain in greatest detail. Next slide. One of the ways we can avoid impacts to birds is use a technique called deconfliction, meaning that we find places in the ocean where the harms to birds would be least. If we can't remove them altogether, we can find places in the ocean where they're reduced greatly. Well, how do we do that? Essentially, we take maps of every species of marine bird that we can, and we overlay it. And based upon the number of intersections and the strength of those intersections, we can map parts of the ocean as hot spots for birds or cold spots. Where do we want to put offshore wind farms? In the cold spots. We don't want to put them in areas that are hot spots for marine birds. And this is a graphical depiction of that process. If we do this, we immediately save ourselves lots of headache and heartache, because if we put it in places where there are few birds, it just greatly reduces the number and the kinds of birds that might experience any adverse impacts. But birds aren't by themselves in the ocean. Next slide. So what we do is we take birds and marine mammals and fish and human uses like, say, shipping or commercial fishery, fishing and so forth, and we create additional layers to deconflict. And based on the intersection of all these layers, we find parts of the oceans where there are the fewest conflicts and areas where there are the most. Again, this creates a heat map that we want to avoid, and a cold map, which is where we want to site wind energy areas. Next slide, please. This is a heat map for the Atlantic Ocean, and this is a study that is only now a few months old. It's one sponsored by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and it shows hot and cold spots for the Atlantic Ocean. I have the red arrow here just so that you can kind of see where Maryland is if you can't see the state outlines. The areas that are lighter blue or orange or yellow are the hot spots for birds. And if you look carefully, you can see kind of two. There's one immediately along the coast where lots of birds occur. And then there's another one that parallels the continental shelf. That's the one further off, about a third of the way down that red arrow. In between is a darker area. That darker area represents the coldest spot that we can find for marine birds. That is the best place to site offshore wind energy projects, those cold spots. And in general, that is exactly what's happened in the Atlantic. Next slide, please. If we can't avoid, the next thing we do is try to minimize the impacts. So once the wind farm is there, once the turbines are operating, how can we do this? Well, we might be able, in the case of bats, to use acoustic deterrence, using some sort of sound frequency that would essentially drive them away. We might paint the turbine blades contrasting black and white colors so that they're more visible to birds, and it would present more of an obstacle as they're flying in or near that area. We could use the sound, conceivably the sounds of a bird in distress or a raptor to keep birds away, at least land birds. Things that we implement after avoidance, but before compensation, are called minimization. And this is an area where the research is very thin, especially in the offshore environment. Next slide, please. When we put offshore wind in place, it has impacts that are uncertain. We know that there are some impacts, but we won't ever be able to tell exactly how many birds it harms. The hierarchy here, the mitigation hierarchy, is shown from left to right. We start off with an avian impact, but we don't know if it's this big or that big. If we can't use avoidance, if avoidance doesn't get all of the impact, and if we can't conclude that it does avoid all impacts, we go on to minimization. But if neither of those work, we'll go further and use the last step of the mitigation hierarchy, and that is compensatory mitigation. Compensatory mitigation uses financial offsets to basically replace the birds that are harmed by the wind farm. That's it in its simplest terms. Well, how would we do something like that? Well, we could do it a couple of ways. I've depicted one way. Let's suppose that before the wind project, we have over here a commercial fishing enterprises that drowns seabirds during longline sets. What we can do then is to replace the birds lost from the wind farm by either buying the permits outright from the fishermen so that they don't fish at all, don't kill any birds, or we can pay for new gear that is deployed in a manner that won't cause birds to be drowned. And of course, that requires very good math keeping and accounting so that we actually do save as many birds as we harm at the wind farm. Now, this only gets us to something called no net loss. In other words, it's a swap. The thinking nowadays is that we ought to do better than that. And many wind energy companies, particularly those in Europe, have decided that's what they want to go. They don't want to stop at no net loss. They want to go further and get to a net positive gain. In other words, for every bird that's lost in a wind farm, let's replace it with 2 somewhere else. And you can do that through a technique like I just illustrated here, or you can actually start saving birds and putting artificial nests or removing exotic predators on their breeding islands so that the numbers of birds go up. That's the concept of these offsets and compensatory mitigation. Next slide. Finally, the last thing we do is we have to monitor what we're doing, what's happening in a wind farm. There are 3 essential triads to this monitoring: horizontal and vertical radar, visual or thermal videography and photography, and acoustic detections and recordings. If we have a system that can do all 3 of those, it will allow us to see how much damage is actually happening at any of these offshore wind farms. Next slide. What does one of those look like? This one is called the ATOM system. It was put off the coast of Virginia for almost 2 years at a turbine, one of the experimental turbines off Virginia. And during that almost 2-year time span, there was 1 close call with a bird and 1 close call with a bat, but no birds were detected actually colliding with the spinning blade. This is the kind of thing that's absolutely essential and vital for us to get wind energy right. We have to have evidence that it's really doing no harm. Okay, next slide. I just want to thank lots and lots of people that made this information possible, and we can stop there, Tess.
Thank you, Chris. I'm going to share one more slide. I'm going to be very brief so that we can have time for questions. Can slideshow from current slide. Okay, can you all see my slides? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chris and John. I want to be very brief so we can get to questions, like I just said. But before that, I want everyone to know that we have two legislative trackers, one for Pennsylvania and one for Maryland. The QR codes will take you to the respective state lists, and the link at the bottom will do that. This leads to our legislative priorities at the state level in both Maryland and Pennsylvania, not all of which are energy related, but some of them are. So please take a look, and Tess can put those in the chat as well. Very quickly for Pennsylvania, the ones that are related to renewable energy development and climate are House Bill 1467, which is the Alternative Energy Portfolio Standards, which is to get to 30% renewables by 2030. A community solar bill, which just passed the House yesterday and is now on its way to the Senate. And a solar on schools bill, which incentivizes solar panels on school buildings in Pennsylvania, also passed the House. And then there's two new initiatives which the governor announced last week. One is the Pennsylvania Reliable Energy Sustainability Standard Act, called PRESS, and that is a 35% renewables by 2035 goal. And then PACER, which is the Pennsylvania Climate Emissions Reduction Act, which is Governor Shapiro's state version of RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. Now, for those last three bullet points, Audubon is still evaluating what exactly that means for the energy landscape in Pennsylvania. But the first three bullet points are still priorities and still very much in play in the state. So we recommend our members contacting their legislators to let them know that they support these bills, because they do advocate for the development of clean energy and are friendly for birds. In Maryland, there's one bill right now that if you live in Maryland, we're encouraging our members to support. It's called the Brighter Tomorrow Act, and it incentivizes renewable energy development on already disturbed land, such as brownfields, rooftops, large parking lots. So not going into pristine bird habitat, but incentivizing the development of solar power on those already disturbed lands. And we're encouraging our members to contact their legislators and voice their support for that legislation in Annapolis now. And then for Maryland, in 2022, the Climate Solutions Now Act was passed. And in 2023, the Power Act was passed. The Climate Solutions Now is the goal to get to zero emissions by 2045. And the Power Act is to make sure that Maryland can implement 8.5 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2031. So we are really advocating for our members to help the state implement these goals by using the policies and techniques that Chris and John just went over. So I'm going to hand it over to Tess to help us get through some of the questions.
The first question we have for John is, the lake effect hypothesis has been studied for the past few years. Can you share any data or conclusions, even if they're tentative?
What I can say for certain is that the conclusions are still tentative. I mean, there's been the lake effect has been observed in a small number of sites in the California desert, north of the Salton Sea, around the area of the Salton Sea. It has not been observed in your area or in other geographies. other than the desert Southwest. And there's considerable uncertainty over when there's carcasses found within a facility, if it is because of the lake effect, or is it what they call a background mortality. So there's investigation going on into all this stuff. I'd be happy to put my email in the chat and email you the most recent research results, but I don't have any more than that detail for now.
Great, thank you. Another question, are birds less vulnerable to collisions with offshore wind than wind farms on land? Or were we looking at successful examples? And if they are, why?
Can you repeat the question? I was answering one.
Sure thing, sorry, Chris. Are birds less vulnerable to collisions with offshore wind than wind farms on land? Or were we looking at successful examples? And if they are, why?
So far, all of the evidence leans in the direction that there are fewer impacts offshore. And that's not too surprising because bird densities are generally a lot lower offshore. You don't have breeding birds that stay in the same place and therefore move around over and over again. Given the lower densities, I don't know that it means that offshore turbines are any less dangerous. It just means I'd be more comfortable by thinking that it's fewer birds around to be harmed. If any of you have seen how many birds have been estimated on land to die every year from wind turbines, the number pales in comparison to other conservation threats. I mean, you can easily Google this and see little graphics that'll say, well, one estimate gave it a couple 100,000 birds, whereas, outdoor cats kill billions of birds, or plate glass windows, millions. So, but so far, and I say this cautiously, the news is good the news is better than expected for collisions. It's worse than expected for habitat loss and displacement.
Great, thank you. Someone asked, where can I find information on the environmental impact of wind farms placed on land resources?
I would suggest the Renewable Energy Wildlife Institute's website. I'll put the link for that in the chat.
Let me see. In terms of decarbonation, is there any legislation in place that ensures that for all new solar or wind energy installed, the equivalent amount of fossil fuel consumption is being eliminated? Just unsure about how we're going to meet our climate goals if we're just increasing overall production without reducing fossil fuel consumption.
I can offer my perspective. That is it's an extremely important issue, but it's a little bit outside of Audubon's area of influence. Our focus is very much on using the science and the data that we have available for renewable siting. And doing that. We know that renewables are coming, and doing that in a way that allowing them to be developed in a way that is not harmful to birds, or is as least harmful to birds as possible. In terms of current levels of consumption of fossil fuel, it is the most important issue, but it's a bit outside of what we can do with the expertise on our staff. We do sign on and support initiatives that call for the reduction of the use of fossil fuels in different states. We work on empower legislation. We're supporting that now in Maryland, and it takes away incentives from greenhouse gas reliant home appliances and puts those incentives towards electric appliances. Some of our offices around the state focus on or around the country, excuse me, focus on land use policies, which prevent sprawl, which then prevents the further use of gas-powered transportation. So it is something we pay attention to, but in this space, we're really focused on getting ready for the pipeline of renewable energy development and making sure that it's done in a bird-friendly manner.
Chris, you might be familiar with this because you were at iBird I Vote, but environmental groups work with solar industry representatives in Maryland to develop comprehensive solar siting legislation for the session. Ultimately, that wasn't successful. Are there any lessons learned from Washington State or the Avian Solar Work Group about how that can be successful in the future?
I mean, those of us in Maryland know how challenging it was to get people to agree on siting standards. And Carol, that's a great question. We can follow up with our colleagues across the country. I know some states in the Midwest have, Minnesota, Iowa, have gotten a little bit further ahead in developing siting guidelines. But yes, it's one of the main obstacles to getting everyone at the table to agree on a common path forward. There's so many disparate interests that it can be difficult. Having said that, with John's eye on solar around the country, I don't know if he has any other perspectives on good coalitions that have helped states develop appropriate siting guidelines for solar.
I would suggest the renewable energy, Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan in California, which was on BLM lands and pushed a very successful guided development strategy that minimize impacts on sensitive habitats and declared what's called development focus areas to guide solar to places where development was incentivized. So that's one successful approach. Another one, which is California, is the San Joaquin least conflict solar siting process, which was a process that occurred on agricultural dominated lands that a lot of which were becoming impaired through lack of water, groundwater access. So there's a kind of a synergy potential there to site on areas that were becoming incompatible with agriculture anyway. So those are a couple examples I can get off the top of my head.
Thank you, everyone. And we are at 4 o'clock. I know we didn't get to all the questions. If you have questions, please feel free to reach out. I just want to thank you all so much for joining us, and thanks to John and Chris for joining us as well. This was really informative. Thank you. The recording will be available on our YouTube, and I'll send it to all registrants as well. Thanks, everyone.